In 1895, times were changing. Queen Victoria was entering the final years of her long reign, and although railways were still the most common means of long-distance travel, cycling was enjoying a surge in popularity thanks to the new safety bicycles, which were more comfortable than the old penny farthings and far less likely to result in broken bones. The Manchester Ship Canal had been open for a year and was transforming trade in the north of England, while in London the newly built Tower Bridge had recently opened to the public, and in the wider world Nikola Tesla was demonstrating his ideas on wireless power. Yet one thing would remain the same, unchanged by the world's advances. There would always be murder, and in this case, a double murder. In today's episode, we'll explore a little-known true crime case that shocked a small North Yorkshire town, drawing together details rarely covered elsewhere. I'm your host Prash, and welcome to another episode of Prash's Murder Map. Robert Hudson was born in June 1872 in Darlington, County Durham, to father Richard, a blacksmith, and mother Elizabeth. He was the eldest of 4 children and grew up in a relatively comfortable lower middle class family, though tragedy struck when his mother died at a young age. By the time Robert was 6, the family had moved to live with his grandmother on her farm in the market town of Helmsley, North Yorkshire, about 25 miles north of the city of York. Surrounded by wide expanses of moorland and dotted with hills, Robert came to know the countryside intimately, spending his time cycling along the lanes and roaming the heathered uplands. By 1891, the Hudson family had moved to 67 Gurney Street in Darlington, a road densely populated with terraced houses which seemed a world away from the farm. Robert, now 18, had completed an apprenticeship in cabinet making and was working as a furniture salesman. He was well dressed, with dark hair and a prominent moustache, and was described as respectable, sober, industrious, and of irreproachable character. He had a circle of friends who held him in high esteem, and, although slim and athletic in appearance, he wasn't particularly strong. Later, Robert obtained a new job in Sheffield, though still as a furniture salesman. There, he met Kate Brown, known as Kitty, who worked as a shop assistant selling small ornaments, stationery and trinkets. The daughter of a local optician, Kitty was born in December 1869 and was 3 years older than Robert, with 4 older siblings, 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Those who knew her described her as intelligent, kind and honest. Robert and Kitty became engaged in 1893 and were married in January the following year at St Mary's Church in Sheffield. On 10th of June 1894, their son was born, suggesting that Kitty had fallen pregnant around 3 months before their marriage. They christened him Heseltine in honour of Robert's middle name and his late mother's maiden name. The small family moved to Burton-on-Trent and then to Nottingham, where Robert supplemented his income with odd painting and decorating jobs. They frequently visited Kitty's parents in Sheffield and always seemed happy. In March 1895, the year after their marriage, Kitty's father died. 2 months later, Robert suggested they take a holiday to Helmsley in North Yorkshire, where he had grown up, from where they could conveniently visit other relatives. Robert spoke so passionately about the area's beauty and the tranquillity of the nearby Roper moorland that Kitty agreed. Robert took charge of all the arrangements and even had his bicycle sent on ahead, apparently looking forward to long rides across the moors. On Friday 24th of May 1895, they arrived in Helmsley and took lodgings with a landlady named Mrs. Mary Ann Holmes. Mrs. Holmes instantly liked 25-year-old Kitty, finding her cheerful, friendly and kind towards her husband and their young son Heseltine, who was less than 12 months old. Likewise, 22-year-old Robert seemed attentive to his wife and son, and over the next few days the trio was seen out and about in the village, walking and taking carriage rides as Robert had borrowed a pony and trap. However, Kitty confided in Mrs. Holmes that she didn't enjoy their frequent drives over the moors, complaining that they were lonely and desolate with barely any trees. The pretty purple heather wouldn't bloom until later in the summer, leaving it barren and unsettling for those who weren't used to the open wilderness. On Wednesday 5th of June, Robert Hudson visited Trenham's ironmonger's and purchased a shovel. Later, a man working nearby saw Hudson cycling towards the moors with the shovel strapped to his bicycle, then observed him returning sometime later without it. On Saturday 8th of June at around 9 a.m, Robert took Kitty and baby Heseltine out for a walk, telling Mrs. Holmes that they would be back in the afternoon and would like ham and eggs for dinner. At 2 p.m, Robert returned to the lodging house alone, telling Mrs. Holmes that his wife and son had gone on to Hovingham, some 8 miles south, to visit his aunt. He ate his dinner and settled the outstanding account, explaining that he intended to follow them to Hovingham and would all return the next day. He seemed friendly and at ease, suggesting that Mrs. Holmes and her daughter might join him and Kitty for a picnic on Ropper Moor when they returned. After Robert left, Mrs. Holmes checked on the room and was surprised to find that clothing belonging to Kitty and the infant had been left strewn across the floor, and the wash basin was unusually dirty, smeared with sand and soil. The next day, Mrs. Holmes and her daughter got ready for the anticipated outing to the moor, but the Hudson family did not return. On Monday 10th of June, Mrs. Holmes received a letter from Kitty Hudson, written in pencil and posted from Nottingham, over 100 miles to the south. Kitty explained that something had prevented them from returning and apologised for the inconvenience, asking if Mrs. Holmes would be kind enough to send the clothes on to an address in Darlington, which turned out to be the home of Robert's parents. Mrs. Holmes thought little of it until she received 2 unexpected visitors. Agnes Robinson, Kitty's older married sister, and their cousin were deeply concerned about her whereabouts and had come all the way from Sheffield. Agnes had received a troubling letter from her brother-in-law, Robert, written in pencil. Part of it read, "My beloved wife Kitty has left me, and worse than that, she has taken the child with her, leaving a note saying she could not live with me and that she'd been unhappy. She left with little or no money, and I don't know what will become of her. I have commenced a search for her and will not give up." The letter also implied that Kitty had gone off with another man, which would have been seen as scandalous by Victorian standards. As a result, despite being convinced that this would be completely out of character for her sister, Agnes decided not to involve the police until she and her cousin had made some inquiries of their own. When they explained their concerns, Mrs. Holmes offered to help them look for Kitty, so the 3 women hired a horse-drawn cab and went to Hovingham to call on Robert's aunt. The elderly woman, who was nearly blind, confirmed that neither Kitty nor Robert nor their child had visited her at any time. Agnes and her cousin then went to Darlington to see Robert's parents. The clothing had recently arrived there, and they showed Agnes a letter they had received from their son, which read, "Kitty is taken off with a man belonging to the neighbourhood of Helmsley, and I have some idea who it is. I have sold my furniture and given up my situation, and I would spend every penny I have got, but I will find her." They had no idea where their daughter-in-law was and hadn't heard anything further. Robert Hudson's father expressed little concern for Kitty, readily believing his son's story, but was keen to find his grandson and intended to ask the police the next morning for help locating him. The two women returned to Helmsley in the hope that Robert or Kitty would turn up there, but by now word had spread and suspicions were rising. The man who had seen Robert cycling towards the moors with a shovel reported the sighting, and local gamekeeper Bob Baker offered to lead a search party. A road mender named Mr. Barker Tyreman remembered seeing a hole dug under a clump of trees a few days earlier and led the party there, along Moorland Road near High Baxton Farm, through a gate and along a bridle path until eventually they reached a cluster of Scots pines just 15 yards off the track. The hole had been filled in, but the soil was less than 9 inches deep, and it didn't take long for them to unearth the bodies of a woman and a child. The shovel was found hidden in the heather about 200 yards from the burial site. The bodies were transported to the Union Workhouse mortuary at Helmsley, where Agnes identified them as her sister Kitty Hudson and her infant son Heseltine. The missing persons case was now a search for a killer. Robert Hudson's description was reported in the press and circulated to police stations around the country. The inquest was held in Helmsley on 17th of June, where the doctor revealed that in both cases the cause of death was severance of the left internal jugular vein. Kitty also had several gashes to her face and severe cuts to her left palm, with her clothing badly torn, suggesting she had put up a tremendous fight to protect herself and her child. A carving knife was found tucked inside her clothing, which was confirmed to be the murder weapon. The post-mortem also revealed a bullet wound to her right temple, establishing that she had been shot in the head after her throat was cut. Agnes identified the carving knife as part of a set belonging to her late sister and her husband, which meant that it had intentionally been brought with them from home or when they had set out for their holiday. Several witnesses came forward to give statements, including the man who had seen Robert Hudson cycling to the moor with a shovel, and the local ironmonger who confirmed he had sold the shovel to Hudson. They also heard new information from a man who had seen the suspect hurrying along the road from the Roper Moor towards Helmsley and offered him a lift in his horse and cart, but Robert had ignored him. A verdict of willful murder against Robert Heseltine Hudson was returned. The funeral of Kitty and Heseltine Hudson took place in Sheffield on Wednesday 19th of June, while the hunt for their killer continued. Police traced Robert Hudson's movements and believed that after fleeing Helmsley, he had first gone to Nottingham, where he had posted the letter to Mrs. Holmes purportedly from Kitty, then travelled to Coventry in the Midlands. There, he had visited a barber shop and asked if he could use their address to have his mail forwarded to. They agreed, and he gave his name as R.H. Hudson. Inspector Dennis of the North Riding of Yorkshire Constabulary spoke to the barber, who handed over a letter that had arrived for Hudson, postmarked Birmingham. The inspector opened the letter, only to find it contained a blank piece of paper. Had he given his real name deliberately to give the impression he was now residing in Coventry? Police inquiries at the Coventry Telegraph Office revealed that Hudson had sent a telegram to his father arranging to meet him at York Station. The police hid at the station and waited for him to arrive, but he never came. It seemed this was another misdirection, calculated to waste police time while he was hiding out in a different town. Suspecting he was in fact in Birmingham, Inspector Dennis travelled there to investigate, tracing him to a lodging house at 27 Pershaw Road, where he had used the alias H. Hunter, but by the time he arrived, he had moved on. While staying in the area, Robert Hudson had kept himself busy spending time in music halls and striking up conversations with attractive young women. He had his photograph taken and had several copies made, and within 3 days of murdering his wife and son, he was placing adverts in the personal columns of the Manchester Courier, Bristol Times, Nottingham Express, and several other papers. One of his adverts included a false age and a false name, and ran: "Bachelor, tall, dark, aged 27, wishes to meet with a lady of some means with a view to early marriage, honourable and sympathetic, name Henry Rogers." He also responded to adverts placed by women who were interested in matrimony, particularly those who mentioned they were independently wealthy. He sent them photos of himself and arranged meetings with some of them, including a Miss Baldwin, whom he enticed into performing an intimate act in the back of a cab. His location became known when Mrs. Wheeler, the landlady he was lodging with at 75 Dawlish Road, Selly Oak, read about the killer at large in the newspaper on 19th of June. Despite the lodger, who called himself Mr. H. Robertson, appearing to be gentlemanly and paying in advance for his board and lodgings, she couldn't help noticing that he closely resembled the police sketch of the wanted man. Her suspicions were confirmed when she crept into his room while he was out and noticed that inside his spare billycock hat was stitched in gold letters the initials HH, which didn't correspond to the name he had registered with. She recalled that a letter had arrived for him in the midday post, addressed to Mr. H. Robertson, but when she held it up to the light, she could see that it was empty. Once again, it seemed Hudson had sent himself a fake letter to the name he'd given the landlady to convince her of his identity. Mrs. Wheeler notified the police. That evening, 10 days after the murders, a plainclothes police sergeant arrived and posed as a guest, finding out from careful questioning of Mrs. Wheeler and other guests that Mr. Robertson appeared respectable and entertained them each evening by playing lively music on the piano. The sergeant waited patiently for the suspect to come downstairs for his tea and made his move. After several denials, the suspect eventually admitted that he was Robert Heseltine Hudson. On his arrest, a revolver was found in his pocket, along with several cartridges and £20 in cash. In his bag were photographs, a pocket notebook, and a carving fork, which matched the knife used to kill his wife and son. He was taken to the police station and charged with murder, seemingly calm and unruffled. Robert Heseltine Hudson was tried at the York Assizes on 23rd of July before Mr. Justice Matthew, defended by Mr. R.V. Ragg. The prosecution was led by former Member of Parliament Mr. Samuel Waddy QC, who also served as Recorder of Sheffield, a prestigious judicial post in which he presided over the city's criminal court. Hudson, who wore a black suit and a white tie, looked unconcerned as the defence lodged an insanity plea on his behalf. Robert's friends and family testified that he was of a nervous disposition and suffered from fits and severe head pains, but 3 doctors, including the medical superintendents from York Lunatic Asylum and the North Riding Lunatic Asylum, could find no evidence to support the claims. On the contrary, there was evidence that the murder had been carefully and skillfully planned. Evidence of motive was explosively revealed when the court heard that Kitty had inherited a legacy of £170 from her father, who had died just 2 months before Robert suggested a holiday on the moors, and a further £170 was to be held in trust for their son. This, along with the evidence that Robert had been advertising his bachelorhood to single wealthy women in the newspapers, suggested his main motivation was money. During the trial, he was seen to smile and wink at several young women in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. While awaiting execution, Robert Hudson wrote to his father to wish him a good life, stating that he regretted the murder and blaming his actions on falling into bad company. Yet he never expressed any public remorse for the brutal deaths of his wife and infant son. The only sign that he might have been sorry was a note made in his pocketbook several days after the murder, which read, "1 week from the saddest event in my life, at 10 to 1 o'clock, and I am living yet." On his final morning, Robert Hudson, now aged 23, had tea, bread and butter for breakfast and was reported to have slept well. He received a visit from the chaplain and remained calm until the moment his sentence was carried out by hangman James Billington at 8 a.m. on Tuesday 13th of August 1895 at York Castle. A small group gathered outside to watch as the black flag was hoisted to indicate that the execution had taken place, and Hudson was buried on the prison grounds. The case, though now obscure and rarely covered in detail, remains a deeply troubling instance of premeditated double murder. It seems that as soon as Robert Hudson learned of his wife's inheritance, he began plotting to take her to the remote moorland under the pretense of showing her his childhood home and enjoying countryside walks, making sure to pack the carving knife from their kitchen with the clear intent of using it. Though he took steps to plant a false trail of evidence after the crime, using multiple aliases and trying to confuse police as to his whereabouts with a series of blank letters, his attempt to conceal the bodies was far less thorough, and the shallow grave in which he placed them was easily found by the search party. He had a steady job and was not in debt, but his motives could only have been the temptation of Kitty's relatively modest inheritance, worth about £50,000 today, and the desire to pursue relationships with other women. It is said that a stone engraved with the date 8th of June 1895 was placed at the burial site, though locals say it was removed during the war and never replaced. As late as the 1980s, a farmer kept the site marked with tree branches so the location would not be forgotten, in case the stone was ever found. The house at 67 Gurney Street, Darlington, where Robert Hudson lived with his parents as a young man prior to his marriage, still stands today, and the Roper Moorland is just as windswept and remote as it was over 130 years ago, though popular with hikers. As is so often the case with murder scenes, there is nothing left except quickly fading local memories passed down through the generations to indicate that a double murder had taken place there, ending the life of a 25-year-old woman and her young son just 2 days before his first birthday. You've been listening to Prash's Murder Map. If you'd like to support the show, please leave me a thumbs up, comment or review. You can also join me on Patreon for ad-free audio-only episodes and sign up for my free newsletter so you can be the first to hear about the latest news and releases. I'll leave the links in the show notes. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you again soon for another true crime episode.